My son complained online that I couldn't afford his gaming setup, so I handed him my bills and told him to budget it himself. The TikTok had 89,000 views when I saw it at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep after pulling a double shift at the warehouse, scrolling through my phone to wind down. That's when I saw my son Ethan's username pop up on my For You page, which was weird because we didn't follow each other. The algorithm had served it up anyway, probably because we shared the same Wi-Fi network. The video showed Ethan sitting in his bedroom, dramatically sighing while pointing to a gaming setup on his screen. Some streamer's rig with RGB lighting, 3 monitors, a high-end PC tower, mechanical keyboard, the works. The caption read, POV, your dad works full-time but can't even afford a decent gaming setup. Guess I'll just keep playing on this potato. The camera panned to his current setup, a 4-year-old gaming laptop I'd saved for 3 months to buy him, sitting on his desk. The comments were brutal. People calling me a deadbeat, asking why I bothered having a kid if I couldn't provide, suggesting Ethan should emancipate himself. A few defended me, saying gaming rigs were luxury items, but they were drowned out by teenagers telling my son he deserved better. I'd been working at Riverside Distribution Center for 7 years when my world shifted on that Thursday night. Started as a picker, worked my way up to shift supervisor, made $19.50 an hour, managing a team of 12 people who loaded and unloaded trucks full of consumer goods bound for retail stores across the Midwest. It was honest work, hard work, the kind that left my back aching and my hands calloused, but it paid the bills. Most of them, anyway. I was 41 years old, raising a 15-year-old son alone since his mother Rachel died in a car accident when Ethan was 8. That had been 7 years of figuring out single parenthood while grieving a wife I'd loved since high school. 7 years of trying to be both parents to a kid who was angry at the world for taking his mom. I'd done my best, kept us in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, made sure Ethan had clothes, food, school supplies, his gaming laptop, a phone, internet fast enough for online gaming. I'd thought that was enough. Apparently, I was wrong. The video sat in my mind like a stone while I tried to sleep. I kept seeing those comments, strangers calling me a failure, my son's dramatic sigh implying the same thing. I finally gave up on sleep around 2 a.m., got up, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at my phone. The view count had climbed to 112,000. Someone had duetted it, adding a comment about toxic parents who don't understand gaming culture. I felt something crack inside my chest, not quite anger, not quite hurt, something in between that tasted bitter. Ethan had no idea what it took to keep us afloat. He'd never asked. I'd never told him because I thought protecting him from financial stress was good parenting. But sitting there at 2 a.m., watching strangers mock me based on my son's public complaint, I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe he needed to understand. Maybe we both did. I didn't confront him in the morning. I was too tired, and he was rushing to get ready for school, grabbing a granola bar in his backpack while scrolling through his phone, probably checking to see how many more views his video had gotten. I watched him leave, this kid who'd grown 3 inches in the past year, who was becoming a stranger in ways that had nothing to do with height. When had he started seeing me as someone who couldn't provide? When had my efforts become embarrassing content for social media? I got ready for work, showered, put on my Riverside uniform polo and jeans, drove my 10-year-old Nissan Sentra to the warehouse, and tried to focus on truck schedules and inventory counts. But my mind kept drifting back to that video, to the casual cruelty of airing our private life for entertainment. My supervisor, a woman named Linda Huang, who'd been with the company for 15 years, noticed I was off during the morning briefing. She pulled me aside around 10:30 a.m. and asked if everything was okay at home. I almost told her about the video, but stopped myself because it felt too pathetic. My kid thinks I'm a failure because I can't buy him a $3,000 gaming rig. What kind of problem was that? The first real sign of trouble came 3 days later. I got a call from Ethan's school counselor, Mr. Gregory Sutton, who'd been working in the district for 23 years according to the bio on the school website. He asked if I could come in for a meeting on Monday morning. His tone was careful, professional, the kind that suggested this wasn't optional. I requested time off from work, which my manager approved reluctantly because we were short-staffed, and showed up at Jefferson High School at 9 a.m., feeling out of place in the administrative office with its fluorescent lights and motivational posters. Mr. Sutton was maybe 55, with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd seen every variety of teenage drama. He shook my hand, offered me a chair in his small office, and pulled up something on his computer screen. Mr. Castellano, I wanted to talk to you about some concerning behavior we've observed with Ethan, he said, turning his monitor so I could see. It was Ethan's TikTok account. The gaming setup video was there, along with several others I hadn't seen. One showed him eating cafeteria lunch with the caption, "When your dad can't even pack you decent food." Another showed his worn sneakers with the caption, "These are 2 years old, but apparently we can't afford new ones." There were at least a dozen videos, all following the same theme, my inadequacy as a provider. My hands went numb looking at those videos. Mr. Sutton explained that several teachers had seen them, that students were talking about it, that there was concern Ethan might be experiencing neglect at home. Neglect. The word hit me like a physical blow. I tried to explain that Ethan had everything he needed, that the laptop he was complaining about cost $1,200 when I bought it, that his sneakers were expensive Nikes that he'd insisted on, that I packed his lunch every morning but he chose to throw it away and buy cafeteria food instead. Mr. Sutton listened patiently, taking notes, his expression neutral. He said he believed me, that he'd worked with Ethan long enough to know he wasn't being physically neglected, but that the school was required to document these situations. He suggested family counseling might help us communicate better about expectations and financial realities. I agreed, because what else could I do? Say no and look defensive? I left that office feeling like I'd been accused of something I couldn't quite define, driving back to work with my chest tight and my mind racing through every parenting decision I'd made since Rachel died. That evening, I confronted Ethan. He was in his room, gaming with friends over Discord, shouting into his headset about someone camping in whatever game they were playing. I stood in his doorway until he noticed me, which took maybe 30 seconds. He pulled off his headset, annoyed at the interruption, and asked what was up. I asked him why he'd been posting videos complaining about our financial situation. His face shifted through confusion, then defensiveness. He said it wasn't that serious, that everyone posted content like that I was overreacting. I told him I'd been called into his school because teachers thought he was being neglected. That got his attention. He sat up straighter, the controller forgotten in his hands. He said he didn't mean for it to go that far, that he was just venting, that his friends all had better setups, and he felt left out. I asked him if he understood how much money I spent on him every month. He shrugged and said he didn't really think about it. That answer made something in me snap, not violently, but decisively. I told him he was going to start thinking about it. Tomorrow, we were sitting down and going through every single expense in this household, and he was going to figure out how to budget for his gaming setup himself. The look on his face was pure disbelief. He started to argue, saying it wasn't fair, that he was just a kid. I told him he was old enough to publicly shame me online, so he was old enough to understand what he was shaming me for. He tried a different angle, saying he'd delete the videos. I told him the damage was done, that the internet was forever, that his teachers and half his school had already seen them. He went quiet at that, maybe realizing for the first time that actions had consequences beyond view counts. I left him sitting there and went to the kitchen to start pulling together documents, bank statements, utility bills, rent receipts, grocery store receipts I'd been saving for tax purposes. I spread them across the kitchen table and waited. An hour later, Ethan emerged from his room, subdued, and sat down across from me. The lesson was about to begin, and neither of us was ready for how brutal it would be. I started with the basics. Our rent was $1,350 per month for a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood with decent schools and low crime. I showed him the lease, pointed out the line items: base rent, water and sewer fee, trash collection, the pet deposit I'd paid even though we didn't have a pet because the landlord required it up front and I'd never gotten it back. Ethan stared at the lease like he'd never seen an official document before, which he probably hadn't. I asked him how much he thought I made per month. He guessed $5,000, which was wildly optimistic. I pulled up my last pay stub on my phone. Gross income for 2 weeks, $1,521. After taxes, health insurance, and my 401k contribution that I could barely afford but knew I needed for retirement, net pay, $1,087. Twice a month, that's $2,174. Ethan's eyes widened. He did the math in his head, realized the rent alone took more than half my monthly income. I watched the realization hit him, watched his face change from defensive to uncertain. I asked him what he thought we should cut to afford his gaming setup. He didn't answer. We moved to utilities next. Electric bill averaging $140 per month, higher in summer when we ran the air conditioning, lower in winter, but not by much because everything in the apartment was electric, including heat. Internet bill, $85 per month for the high-speed plan Ethan needed for gaming. I downgraded my phone plan to save money, but kept the internet fast. Water included in rent, but gas for my car, roughly $200 per month depending on prices. I drove 45 minutes each way to work because the warehouse was in an industrial area far from residential neighborhoods. Car insurance, $167 per month for basic coverage on a 10-year-old vehicle. I showed him each bill, let him hold the physical papers, see the account numbers and due dates. His phone bill, $75 per month for unlimited data because he'd begged for it, saying all his friends had unlimited. I'd added it to my plan, increasing my own costs. Groceries, I pulled out receipts from the past month, totaling $487. That included the snacks he constantly requested, the specific brands of cereal he insisted on, the energy drinks he'd started buying that cost $3 each. Ethan was quiet now, really quiet, his earlier defensiveness completely gone. I kept going because he needed to see all of it. Health insurance through my work covered both of us, but the premium was $340 per month deducted from my paycheck. I showed him the explanation of benefits from his last doctor's visit, the one where we'd gotten his ADHD medication adjusted. The visit cost $180 after insurance. The medication cost $65 per month. His school expenses, fees for activities, sports equipment when he'd briefly tried basketball before quitting, school supplies, the graphing calculator I'd bought him for math class that cost $120, clothes, shoes, The winter coat I'd bought him in November because he'd outgrown last year's, total maybe $600 over the past 6 months. I itemized everything, showed him the credit card statements where I'd put some of these purchases because I didn't have the cash up front, showed him the interest charges I was paying every month because I couldn't pay the balance in full. $43 in interest last month alone, money that bought us nothing, but bought me the flexibility to spread costs out. I pulled out a calculator and made him add it up with me. Rent, utilities, car expenses, groceries, insurance, phone, medical costs, his school stuff, minimum credit card payments, basic toiletries and household supplies. The monthly total came to $3,641. My monthly take-home pay, $2,174. Ethan stared at the numbers, his face pale. He asked how we weren't homeless. I explained that I worked overtime whenever available, picking up extra shifts, sometimes working 6 days a week instead of 5. That added maybe $400 to $600 per month depending on availability. I explained that I'd been pulling from my savings account, the one I'd built up before Rachel died, watching it slowly drain year after year. I showed him the balance, $4,200, down from $18,000 7 years ago. I explained that I bought clothes for myself at thrift stores, that I'd been driving the same car for a decade, that I packed my lunch every single day, that I hadn't been to a dentist in 3 years because I couldn't afford the copay for anything beyond emergencies. Every financial decision I made was calculated against whether we'd make it to next month. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ethan sat there looking at the papers spread across the table, at the calculator showing numbers that didn't work, at the reality I'd been shielding him from for years. I asked him again where he thought the money should come from for a $3,000 gaming setup. He said quietly that he didn't know. I told him that was the problem. He'd been making demands without understanding the constraints. He'd been judging me without knowing the full picture. And he'd been broadcasting that judgment to thousands of strangers who now thought I was a failure as a father. The videos had to come down, all of them. He nodded, pulled out his phone with shaking hands, and started deleting. I watched each video disappear, though I knew screenshots existed, that nothing was ever truly gone from the internet. When he finished, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said he was sorry. I told him sorry wasn't enough. He needed to understand what life actually cost, so for the next 3 months, he was taking over the household budget. The color drained from Ethan's face. He asked what I meant, and I explained that starting next month, he would receive my paychecks and be responsible for paying every bill on time. He'd decide what we could afford, what we couldn't, what got prioritized, and what got delayed. He'd do the grocery shopping with a budget he set. He'd track expenses. He'd figure out how to make the numbers work. I'd supervise, make sure nothing critical got missed, but the decisions would be his. And at the end of 3 months, if he could find room in the budget for a gaming setup, I'd match whatever he'd managed to save toward it. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to ask if I was serious. I told him I'd never been more serious about anything. He tried to argue that he was 15, that this was too much responsibility, that he had school and homework. I reminded him that I had work and bills and a teenager to raise, and I managed to fit it all in. The paralysis on his face was almost satisfying. Almost. Mostly, it just made me sad that it had come to this. We started the next day, which was a Saturday. I took Ethan to the bank where I had my checking account, introduced him to the branch manager, a woman named Patricia Donovan who'd worked in banking for 19 years. I explained the situation, that my son was learning financial responsibility, and asked if she could help us set up view-only access to my account so he could track balances and transactions. Patricia looked surprised but agreed, taking us to her office and walking Ethan through the online banking system. She showed him how to check the balance, view pending transactions, see what had cleared. She explained overdraft fees, the importance of tracking spending, how to spot fraudulent charges. Ethan nodded along, taking notes on his phone, looking overwhelmed. Patricia ended the meeting by saying this was an unusual but valuable lesson, that most kids his age had no concept of household finances. She handed Ethan her business card and told him to call if he had questions. The fact that a stranger was treating this as educational rather than crazy made me feel slightly less insane. The first bill came due 4 days later, the electric company. I handed Ethan the notice, told him the login credentials for the online payment system, and told him to handle it. He logged in, stared at the amount due, $152 this month, because we'd had a cold snap and the heat had been running constantly. He asked which account to pay from. I told him to check the balance first. He pulled it up on my phone. $387 remaining until my next paycheck in 5 days. His face went through a complicated series of expressions as he calculated whether paying the electric bill would leave enough for groceries and gas. He asked what happened if we didn't pay. I told him the power got shut off after 30 days, but we'd get hit with a late fee after 15 days. He asked how much the late fee was. I told him $25. He sat there trying to optimize the decision, finally asking if we could wait a few days until my paycheck hit. I said yes, that was fine, that was smart thinking. He looked relieved, like he'd passed some kind of test. I didn't tell him that waiting was what I did every month, that I'd been living in this space between due dates and shut-off notices for years. 2 weeks in, the grocery situation became critical. We were out of most staples, The milk had gone bad, the bread was moldy, Ethan's precious energy drinks were long gone. I handed him $150 cash and told him to go to the grocery store and get what we needed for the next 2 weeks. He looked at the money like I'd handed him a puzzle. I reminded him that we'd spent $487 last month, that $150 was roughly half of that he needed to be strategic. He asked if he could use my car. I said yes, handed him the keys, and watched him drive away with the confidence of a kid who'd done this 100 times with his mom's credit card. He returned 2 hours later with 4 bags of groceries and $3.47 in change. I looked through the bags: ramen noodles, pasta, rice, frozen vegetables, the cheapest bread, store-brand peanut butter, generic cereal, chicken thighs instead of breasts because they were cheaper per pound, no snacks, no energy drinks, no name brand anything. He'd figured out how to eat for 2 weeks on $150, and it looked nothing like what we usually bought. He stood in the kitchen looking proud and exhausted, waiting for me to say something. I told him he'd done well, that those were the kinds of choices I made every shopping trip. The breaking point came in week 3 when Ethan's phone bill was due. He'd been tracking it on his calendar, knew it was coming, had even mentioned needing to pay it. But when the day arrived and he logged in to make the payment, he saw the amount: $75. Our checking account had $89. My next paycheck wasn't for 4 days. We needed gas for my car to get to work, about $30 to fill the tank enough for the week. That left $59 in the account if he paid for gas, not enough for the phone bill. He could pay the phone bill and skip the gas, but then I couldn't get to work, which meant no paycheck on Friday. He sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone, actually staring at it, this device that cost $75 per month to keep active, and I watched him realize he might have to choose between communication and survival. His hands were shaking when he looked up at me. He asked what we were supposed to do. I told him this was his budget to manage, his decision to make. He said there was no right answer, that both options were bad. I agreed. Welcome to poverty math, where every choice was a calculation of which disaster to avoid. Ethan made the call himself. He phoned the wireless carrier, waited on hold for 20 minutes, and asked the representative about suspending service temporarily. The rep, according to Ethan's retelling afterward, explained that suspension would cost $10 per month, and his number would be held for up to 90 days, but he wouldn't have service. Ethan asked if there was a cheaper plan we could switch to. The rep checked and found a $40 per month plan with limited data. Ethan took it, downgrading on the spot, watching his unlimited data disappear. He hung up looking stunned, like he'd just negotiated a hostage situation. I asked him why he'd chosen that option. He said because keeping some service was better than none, and the $35 per month savings could go toward other bills. He'd made a rational decision under pressure. I told him that was exactly right. That was how you survived. He asked how long I'd been making decisions like this. I told him 7 years, since his mother died, and our household income got cut in half. His face crumpled and he started crying, really crying, the kind of desperate sobs he hadn't let me see since the funeral. The school counselor called again in week 5. Mr. Sutton wanted an update on how things were going at home, whether we'd started family therapy like he'd suggested. I explained what Ethan was doing, the budget management, the bill paying, the financial education. There was a long pause on the line. Mr. Sutton asked if I thought this approach was healthy, if it might be too much pressure for a 15-year-old. I asked him what he'd suggested when he thought Ethan was being neglected. He said family counseling to improve communication. I told him this was communication, that words hadn't worked, that Ethan needed to experience the reality before he could understand it. Another pause. He said he'd like to meet with both of us, that he wanted to make sure Ethan was coping okay with the responsibility. I agreed, because refusing would look worse, and we scheduled a meeting for the following Monday morning. I took more time off work, which my manager was increasingly annoyed about, and showed up at the school with Ethan. Mr. Sutton's office felt smaller with both of us in it. He asked Ethan directly how he was handling the household finances. Ethan, to his credit, was honest. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, that he hadn't slept well in weeks, that he constantly worried about missing a payment or making the wrong decision. He said he'd stopped posting on social media entirely because he was too stressed to care about TikTok. He said his friends had noticed he wasn't gaming as much, that he'd stopped buying lunch at school and started bringing the sandwiches he made himself. He said he finally understood why I'd been saying no to things, why I drove an old car, why we didn't go on vacations. He said he felt terrible about the videos, about what he'd said, about judging me when he didn't understand. Mr. Sutton listened to all of this, taking notes, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned to me and asked if I thought Ethan had learned the lesson. I said I thought he was starting to, but that 3 months had been the agreement, and we were sticking to it. Mr. Sutton looked like he wanted to argue, but instead said he'd check in again in a few weeks. Week 7 brought an unexpected crisis that tested everything Ethan had learned. My car, the 10-year-old Nissan that had been reliable for years, started making a grinding noise on my drive to work. By the time I got to the warehouse, it was barely drivable. I took it to a mechanic during my lunch break, a shop I'd been using for years run by a guy named Tony Messina, who'd been fixing cars for 32 years. Tony diagnosed the problem in 15 minutes. Failing brake pads and rotors, both needed immediate replacement. The cost, $680. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't have $680. Tony knew me well enough to offer a payment plan, $200 up front and $100 per month for 5 months. But even $200 was money we didn't have in the budget. I drove the car home carefully, the grinding getting worse, and delivered the news to Ethan. He stared at me like I'd told him we were being evicted. He pulled up the budget spreadsheet he'd been maintaining, scanned through every line item, looking for $200 we could spare. There wasn't any. Everything was allocated. We were already running negative some months, being bailed out by my overtime when it was available. Ethan asked what we were supposed to do. I told him this was the reality I'd been living with, that emergencies happened and there was no safety net. He asked about my savings account, the one I'd shown him with $4,200. I explained that was supposed to last us until he turned 18, maybe longer if I was careful, that using it for car repairs would deplete it faster. He did the math, realized that at the rate we were draining it, the account would be empty in less than 2 years anyway. He asked what happened when it ran out. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that I'd been hoping to find a better job or get a promotion or somehow increase my income before that happened. The look on his face was pure fear, the kind that came from understanding your safety was an illusion. He asked if he could get a job, if his income could help. I reminded him he was 15, that work permits were restricted, that any job he could get would pay minimum wage and wouldn't solve the fundamental problem that our expenses exceeded my income. We sat in silence for a long time, two people staring at a problem that had no good solution. The car repair forced a decision. We took $200 from savings, paid Tony the upfront cost, committed to the payment plan that would strain our budget for the next 5 months. Ethan watched the savings account balance drop to $4,000 and looked physically ill. That night, he came to me with a proposal. He said he'd been thinking about the gaming setup, about how ridiculous it was that he'd complained about not having $3,000 in luxury items when we were struggling to afford $680 in necessary repairs. He said he wanted to cancel the agreement about saving for the gaming rig. Instead, he wanted to help me figure out how to increase our income or decrease our expenses permanently. He'd been researching online, found information about financial assistance programs, food banks, utility assistance, things I'd been too proud or too ignorant to investigate. He showed me websites, phone numbers, application processes. This kid who'd mocked me online 6 weeks ago was now trying to save us both. I didn't know whether to be proud or devastated that it had come to this. We started applying for assistance programs together. First was SNAP, the food stamp program. The application was humiliating, asking for documentation of every source of income, every asset, every expense. Ethan helped me gather the paperwork, scanning bank statements and pay stubs, uploading them to the state portal. The automated system estimated we'd qualify for $290 per month in benefits, which would cut our grocery costs significantly. We also applied for LIHEAP, the Energy Assistance Program, which could provide a one-time payment toward our electric bill. And we got on the waiting list for Section 8 housing assistance, though the caseworker, a tired-sounding woman named Diane Foster, who'd worked for the Housing Authority for 16 years, told us the wait was currently 3 to 5 years. Ethan took notes on all of it, creating a spreadsheet to track application dates, required documentation, follow-up calls needed. He'd become a project manager for our survival, and he was 15 years old. The unfairness of it hit me like a wave. This shouldn't be his responsibility. He should be worrying about algebra homework and video games, not whether we'd eat next month. The SNAP benefits were approved 3 weeks later. We received an EBT card in the mail with $290 loaded on it, and Ethan held it like it was made of gold. He planned that first shopping trip meticulously, researching which stores accepted EBT, which had the best prices, what items were eligible versus what weren't. We went together on a Saturday morning, and I watched him navigate the store with a calculator app open on his phone, tracking every purchase, making sure we stayed within budget while getting maximum nutritional value. He bought things I'd never have thought to buy: dried beans, rice in bulk, frozen vegetables when they were on sale, chicken leg quarters instead of breasts because you got more protein per dollar. The cashier rang up $287.63 worth of groceries, and Ethan swiped the EBT card with hands that only shook a little. When the transaction went through, he looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years: relief. We loaded the groceries into the car, and he said quietly that this would help, that we could make it work. I believed him. The transformation in Ethan was remarkable and heartbreaking. His grades, which had been slipping before all of this started, actually improved because he'd stopped gaming every night. He spent his free time researching money-saving strategies, finding coupons, tracking utility usage to lower our bills. He'd started a spreadsheet comparing our electric costs month over month, noting that we could save money by unplugging devices we weren't using, by doing laundry in cold water, by keeping the thermostat lower in winter. He presented these findings to me like a business consultant, complete with graphs he'd made in Excel. This was the same kid who 8 weeks ago thought budgeting meant choosing which video game to buy first. Now he was optimizing our household's energy consumption. I didn't know whether I'd given him valuable life skills or robbed him of his childhood. Probably both. Week 11 brought a surprise. My manager at the warehouse called me into her office and offered me a promotion. Linda explained that they were opening a new shift and needed someone to run it, that she'd been impressed with my reliability and work ethic, that the position came with a raise to $23.50 per hour. That was $4 more per hour, an extra $160 per week, roughly $640 per month before taxes. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was significant. There was a catch, though. The new shift was overnight, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. That meant I'd be sleeping during the day when Ethan was at school, awake at night when he was sleeping. Our schedules completely opposite. Linda said she understood if I needed to decline for family reasons, that she'd give me 24 hours to decide. I thanked her and drove home in a daze, running calculations in my head. $640 more per month would change everything. We could replenish savings, handle emergencies without panic, maybe even start planning for Ethan's college. But it also meant being even less present in his life than I already was. I told Ethan about the promotion that evening. He was at the kitchen table doing homework, and he looked up when I explained the offer. I walked through the numbers with him, the raise, what it would mean monthly, the schedule change, what we'd gain, and what we'd lose. He listened carefully, then pulled up our budget spreadsheet without me asking. He created a new column showing projected income with the raise, recalculated our monthly deficit, showed me that we'd actually be running a small surplus instead of slowly drowning. Then he looked at me and asked what I wanted to do. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that the money would help, but the schedule would hurt, that I didn't want him raising himself. He said something then that I'll never forget. "Dad, you've been raising me alone for 7 years. Another few hours apart won't change that. Take the promotion. We need it." He was right, and that was what hurt the most. We did need it. So I called Linda the next morning and accepted. The overnight shift started the following week. The transition was brutal. Sleeping during the day was harder than I expected, my body fighting the reversed schedule, and being awake all night felt surreal. But the work was the same, supervising loading and unloading, checking inventory, making sure trucks departed on schedule. The crew on overnight was different, though, quieter, more desperate. These were people who took night shift because they had to, because of childcare issues or second jobs or circumstances that didn't allow for normal hours. I fit right in. The first paycheck with the raise hit our account 2 weeks later, and Ethan checked the balance immediately. He showed me the number, $1,348 for 1 week after taxes, about $300 more than usual. He updated the budget spreadsheet with actual numbers instead of projections, and for the first time in our 3-month experiment, we ended the month with money left over. Not much, just $143, but it was something. Ethan suggested putting it straight into savings. I agreed. We were rebuilding, slowly, and my son was the architect. Month 3 ended on a Wednesday. Ethan had managed our household finances for 91 days, paid every bill on time, kept us fed and housed and functional, learned more about survival than any 15-year-old should have to know. That evening, we sat down at the kitchen table where this had all started, and I told him the experiment was over. He could hand the responsibilities back to me. He'd fulfilled his end of the agreement. He looked at the pile of bills, the spreadsheets, the calendar full of due dates, and said something unexpected. He wanted to keep helping, not managing everything, but staying involved, reviewing the budget weekly, making decisions together. He said doing this had changed how he saw everything, that he couldn't go back to not knowing. I told him that was fine, that we could share the load. Then I asked him about the gaming setup, whether he still wanted one, whether he'd found room in the budget to save for it. He looked at me like I'd asked a ridiculous question and said no, that he'd rather put money toward our emergency fund, that the gaming laptop he had was fine, that he'd been stupid and entitled, and he understood now what mattered. The school counselor requested one final meeting in early December. Mr. Sutton wanted to close out Ethan's file, do a final check-in, make sure we were stable. We sat in his office again, the 3 of us, and he asked Ethan the same questions as before. How was he doing? How was our relationship? Did he feel safe at home? Ethan answered honestly. He was doing better than he'd expected. Our relationship had improved because we talked more about real things now, and yes, he felt safe. Mr. Sutton asked if he regretted the TikTok videos. Ethan said every day that he couldn't believe he'd been so thoughtless, that he'd publicly humiliated the person who'd sacrificed everything for him. He said the videos had been deleted, but the shame remained, that he'd learned you couldn't unsay things, couldn't undo hurt once it was done. Mr. Sutton nodded slowly and closed his notes. He said this was an unconventional resolution, that he'd had doubts about my approach initially, but that he couldn't argue with the outcome. Ethan had matured significantly, our communication had improved, and we were financially more stable than before. He wished us well and said we didn't need to come back unless we wanted to. 6 months after the original videos, something unexpected happened. Ethan started posting again on TikTok, but the content was completely different. He made videos about budgeting, about how to grocery shop on a tight budget, about understanding bills and expenses, about having gratitude for what you had instead of complaining about what you didn't. His first video back was titled, "I posted my dad's salary to shame him. Here's what I learned." In it, he explained the whole situation, what he'd done, why it was wrong, what he'd learned by managing our household finances for 3 months. He didn't show me or use my name, just talked about the experience and the lessons. The video got 340,000 views. The comments were different this time, people thanking him for being honest, sharing their own financial struggles, asking for advice on budgeting. Ethan had accidentally become a voice for financial literacy among teenagers. And he took the responsibility seriously. He researched before posting, fact-checked information, provided resources. Watching him use social media to educate instead of mock was surreal. One of his videos caught the attention of a local news station. They reached out asking if Ethan would be willing to do an interview about teen financial literacy. He asked me first, making sure I was okay with our story being more public. I told him it was his decision, that he'd earned the right to tell his own story. The interview aired on a Friday evening, Ethan sitting across from a reporter named Michelle Keating, 17 years in broadcast journalism, talking about how managing household finances had changed his perspective on money and family. The segment was only 4 minutes long, but it was honest and vulnerable in a way that made me proud. Michelle asked if his dad had seen the videos. Ethan said yes, that I'd been supportive of his new content because it helped other kids avoid his mistakes. That was the first I'd heard about it, but it was true. The segment ended with a call to action. Parents and kids should talk about money honestly, before crisis made it necessary. The promotion's increased income had given us breathing room for the first time in years. By spring, our savings account had climbed back up to $6,400. We were current on all bills. We'd even managed to pay off the car repair payment plan early. Ethan was still involved in the budgeting process, still researching ways to optimize spending, still posting financial literacy content that had amassed him 89,000 followers. His online presence had gone from mocking me to honoring the struggle we shared. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was relational. We talked now, really talked, about fears and hopes and the reality that life was hard but manageable if you faced it together. He asked me about his mom sometimes, questions he'd been too young to ask when she died. I told him about Rachel, about how she'd have been proud of who he was becoming, how she'd have handled our financial struggles with the same grace she'd handled everything else. Those conversations were painful and healing in equal measure. Ethan's 16th birthday arrived in June. I'd been saving small amounts for months, maybe $20 here and there, and I'd managed to accumulate $380. I asked him what he wanted to do for his birthday, fully expecting him to request something modest. He said he'd been thinking about it and wanted to donate the money to a local charity that helped single-parent families with emergency expenses. He'd found them through his financial literacy research, had read stories about families facing exactly what we'd been through, and wanted to help. I told him he could do whatever he wanted with birthday money, but he insisted this was important to him. We went together to the charity's office, a small nonprofit run by a woman named Carol Dennison, who'd been doing this work for 23 years. Ethan handed her an envelope with $380 in cash and said it was from a family that had struggled but made it through. Carol teared up, said this donation could keep a family's utilities on for a month, buy groceries for weeks, prevent a crisis. Ethan nodded like he knew exactly what it meant. Because he did. The gaming setup he'd originally demanded, the one that started everything, eventually materialized in an unexpected way. One of Ethan's TikTok videos about budgeting went viral enough that a gaming equipment company reached out offering to sponsor him. They'd send him a high-end setup worth roughly $3,500 if he'd feature it in videos and talk about their brand. Ethan showed me the email, excited but uncertain. I read through the contract they'd sent, had Patricia from the bank look it over since she'd become something of an informal advisor for us, and determined it was legitimate. The catch was that accepting it meant Ethan's social media became more professional, more obligated. He'd have to post certain content on schedule, mention the brand regularly, maintain a relationship with their marketing team. It was work, not a gift. Ethan thought about it for 2 days, then declined. He said the setup wasn't worth compromising the authentic content he'd been creating, that his followers trusted him because he wasn't selling them things. I was proud of that decision in a way that was hard to articulate. A year after those first videos went up, Ethan was a different person. Taller, more mature, with an understanding of the world that most adults didn't achieve until much later, if at all. His grades were excellent, because he understood now that education was his path to a different financial reality than mine. He'd started researching scholarships, colleges with good financial aid, career paths that balanced passion and practicality. He talked about wanting to study finance or economics, using what he'd learned to help others. His social media following had grown to 156,000, and he used the platform responsibly, partnering with nonprofit organizations focused on financial literacy, sharing resources, answering questions from teenagers who were dealing with similar situations at home. He'd turned his worst moment into something constructive, and I respected that more than I could say. The warehouse promoted me again in the fall, this time to operations manager, overseeing multiple shifts instead of just one. The salary jumped to $62,000 annually, the first time I'd broken $60,000 in my life. It came with benefits, real benefits, better health insurance, a 401k match, paid time off I'd actually be allowed to use. When I told Ethan, he pulled up our budget spreadsheet immediately, his first instinct still to calculate what this meant for our financial security. I told him to close the laptop, that we were going to celebrate instead of optimize. We went to dinner at a restaurant, the first time in years we'd eaten somewhere with tablecloths and waiters. Ethan ordered carefully, still conscious of cost, still calculating even when I told him not to. Some habits ran deep. Over pasta and breadsticks, I thanked him for what he'd done over the past year, for learning the lessons, for growing up faster than he should have had to, for becoming someone I was genuinely proud to know. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but also the most important. 2 years after the original incident, Ethan graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to a state university's business school. The scholarship covered tuition, room, board, everything, a combination of academic merit and financial need that wouldn't have been possible without his essay about managing household finances as a teenager. At graduation, sitting in the bleachers watching him walk across that stage, I thought about those TikTok videos that had started everything, about the gaming setup he'd demanded, about the budget spreadsheets and SNAP benefits and late-night conversations about money. All of it had been necessary. All of it had brought us here. Ethan found me after the ceremony, diploma in hand, and hugged me in front of everyone. He said thank you for not giving up on him, for teaching him what mattered, for showing him that love sometimes looked like hard lessons instead of easy gifts. I told him he'd taught me just as much, that I'd been so focused on providing that I'd forgotten to prepare him for reality. We'd learned together. The gaming setup, the original source of conflict, stayed empty. Ethan went to college with the same laptop I'd bought him 4 years earlier, the one he'd called a potato in that first video. It still worked. It was still enough. And when people asked him about his setup now, about why he didn't have the latest equipment despite his social media following, he'd show them that laptop and tell them the story of what it represented. A father who'd worked overtime for months to buy it, a son who'd learned to be grateful instead of entitled, a family that had survived poverty by facing it together instead of letting it break them apart. That laptop was worth more than any high-end rig because of what it symbolized. Sometimes the most valuable things weren't the ones that cost the most money. Sometimes they were the ones that cost the most to understand. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.